Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen stood at attention in Admiral Morrison's private office aboard the USS Valiant, her crisp white uniform immaculate despite the grueling 12-hour shift she had just completed. The steel-gray walls of the Admiral's quarters reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting, casting sharp shadows across his weathered face as he sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers drumming impatiently against its polished surface. Sarah had been summoned here without explanation, pulled from her duties in the ship's intelligence division where she had been working on a classified operation that could change the course of their current mission. The timing felt deliberate, almost calculated, and something in the Admiral's cold blue eyes told her this wasn't going to be a routine debriefing. Admiral James Morrison was a man who commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His 30-year naval career was built on a foundation of ruthless ambition and an unwavering belief that the rules applied differently to those with enough stars on their shoulders. At 55, he had climbed the ranks by stepping on anyone who dared to question his authority, and his reputation for destroying careers preceded him like a storm cloud. "Commander Chen," Morrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade, each word carefully measured and dripping with authority. "I've been reviewing your recent performance reports, and I'm afraid there are some concerning patterns emerging." Sarah maintained her rigid posture, her dark eyes fixed on a point just above the Admiral's head. She had expected this confrontation ever since she had discovered the discrepancies in the mission reports 3 weeks ago. The evidence she had uncovered painted a picture of corruption that reached the highest levels of their command structure, and she knew that her investigation had not gone unnoticed. "Sir, I'm not sure what concerns you're referring to," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension building in her chest. "My department has exceeded all performance metrics this quarter, and our intelligence gathering has been instrumental in the success of Operation Silent Thunder." Morrison's lips curved into a predatory smile that never reached his eyes. He stood slowly, his imposing 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the small office as he moved around the desk to stand directly in front of her. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic smell of the ship's recycled air, creating an atmosphere that felt suffocating and oppressive. "That's precisely the problem, Commander," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You've been gathering intelligence that extends far beyond the scope of your assigned duties. Intelligence that could be problematic for certain ongoing operations." Sarah's mind raced as she processed his words. She had been careful to keep her investigation compartmentalized, sharing her findings only with her most trusted subordinates. The fact that Morrison was confronting her directly meant that either there was a leak in her team, or his network of informants was more extensive than she had anticipated. The evidence she had collected over the past month painted a damning picture of Morrison's involvement in arms trafficking, using naval resources to transport weapons to insurgent groups in exchange for significant financial compensation. The profits were being funneled through a complex network of shell companies, ultimately ending up in offshore accounts that Morrison thought were beyond the reach of naval intelligence. "Admiral, if you're suggesting that I've overstepped my authority, I'd like to review the specific instances you're referencing," Sarah said, carefully choosing her words. "All of my intelligence gathering has been conducted within the parameters of my security clearance and in service of our mission objectives." Morrison chuckled, a sound devoid of any genuine humor. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a manila folder, its contents thick with documents and photographs. As he opened it, Sarah caught glimpses of surveillance photos showing her meeting with Commander Rodriguez from Internal Affairs, transaction records from the suspicious bank accounts she had been tracking, and communication intercepts that should have been classified far above Morrison's clearance level. "You see, Commander, this is where you've made your first mistake," Morrison said, spreading the contents of the folder across his desk like a poker player revealing a winning hand. "You assumed that your little investigation was conducted in secret. You underestimated the reach of my network and overestimated your own cleverness." Sarah's heart rate increased as she realized the extent of Morrison's surveillance operation. Not only had he been monitoring her investigation, but he had also been systematically gathering evidence to use against her. The photographs showed meetings that had taken place in supposedly secure locations, and the communication intercepts revealed that her encrypted channels had been compromised for weeks. These documents show a pattern of insubordination and unauthorized intelligence gathering that borders on treason, Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength as he sensed her growing unease. "Meeting with Internal Affairs without proper authorization, accessing classified financial records beyond your clearance level, and conducting surveillance on superior officers are all court-martial offenses. The Admiral moved closer, invading her personal space in a deliberate attempt to intimidate her. Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the coffee on his breath as he leaned in, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "However, I'm prepared to offer you a way out of this unfortunate situation," he said, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of weakness. "Your career doesn't have to end in disgrace. You could walk away from this with your reputation intact, perhaps even with a commendation for your service." Sarah knew that whatever Morrison was about to propose would compromise everything she had worked for during her 15-year naval career. The principles that had guided her service, the oath she had sworn to protect and defend, all of it would be meaningless if she capitulated to his demands now. "What exactly are you proposing, Admiral?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Morrison's smile widened as he sensed an opportunity to leverage his position. He had used the same tactic dozens of times throughout his career, identifying potential threats and neutralizing them through a combination of blackmail, intimidation, and strategic career management. "It's quite simple, Commander. You're going to cease your unauthorized investigation immediately. You're going to turn over all evidence you've collected to me for proper disposal. And you're going to sign a statement acknowledging that your actions were the result of a misunderstanding of your duties and responsibilities." The silence in the room stretched between them like a taut wire, charged with tension and unspoken threats. Sarah could hear the distant hum of the ship's engines and the muffled sounds of sailors going about their duties in the corridors beyond the Admiral's office. Life aboard the USS Valiant continued its normal rhythm while her world teetered on the edge of collapse. "And if I refuse?" Sarah asked, though she could already anticipate his response. Morrison's expression darkened, and, for a moment, she caught a glimpse of the ruthless ambition that had propelled him to his current position. His mask of professional courtesy slipped, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "Then, you'll find yourself facing a general court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and conspiracy against the United States Navy," he said, his voice hardening with each word. "Your career will be destroyed, your security clearance revoked, and you'll spend the next 10 to 15 years in a military prison contemplating the consequences of your poor judgment." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her as Morrison continued his psychological assault. She thought about her family, her young daughter who looked up to her with such pride, her parents who had sacrificed so much to support her military education. The shame of a court-martial would not only destroy her life but devastate everyone she cared about. "You have 48 hours to make your decision, Commander," Morrison said, returning to his seat behind the desk with the satisfied air of a man who had just secured another victory. "I trust you'll make the right choice for everyone involved." As Sarah stood there, processing the magnitude of the trap that had been set for her, Morrison delivered what he clearly intended to be the final blow to her resistance. "Remove your uniform," the Admiral commanded, his voice taking on a tone of absolute authority that brooked no argument. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and, for a moment, she felt the room spinning around her. The sheer audacity of the demand, the blatant abuse of power it represented, crystallized everything she had suspected about Morrison's character into a single, crystalline moment of clarity. But, instead of the fear or compliance that Morrison expected, something else flickered in Sarah's dark eyes. A spark of defiance that had been building throughout their conversation suddenly blazed into a full flame of determination. Her lips curved into a slight smile, and, when she spoke, her voice carried a confidence that seemed to catch the Admiral completely off guard. "You just made the worst mistake," she said, her words delivered with such quiet certainty that Morrison actually took a step backward. The Admiral's confident expression faltered as he realized that his carefully orchestrated intimidation campaign had not had the desired effect. Instead of breaking her spirit, his overreach had awakened something dangerous in Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, something that would prove to be far more formidable than he had anticipated. Sarah's mind was already racing ahead, calculating moves and countermoves in a game that Morrison thought he had already won. But what he didn't know was that she had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and his demand for her uniform had just provided her with the final piece of evidence she needed to bring his entire operation crashing down. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and, both officers understood that only one of them would emerge from this confrontation with their career intact. Morrison had spent decades perfecting his system of corruption and intimidation, but he was about to discover that he had finally met an opponent who refused to be intimidated. As the tension in the room reached a breaking point, Sarah's smile widened slightly. She had been waiting for Morrison to overplay his hand, and his crude attempt to humiliate and control her had given her exactly the opening she needed. The Admiral thought he held all the cards, but he was about to learn that Lieutenant Commander Chen had been playing an entirely different game all along. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only their individual fates but also expose a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of naval command. Morrison's empire of intimidation was about to face its greatest challenge, and Sarah Chen was more than ready for the fight of her career. Sarah Chen remained motionless for several seconds after delivering her warning, watching as confusion and, then, anger flickered across Admiral Morrison's weathered features. The man who had built his career on intimidating subordinates was experiencing something entirely foreign to his usual interactions, and his discomfort was becoming increasingly evident. "Excuse me, Commander?" Morrison's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, betraying the first hint of uncertainty she had heard from him during their entire confrontation. "I think you've misunderstood the gravity of your situation." Sarah's smile never wavered as she reached into her uniform pocket, her movements deliberate and controlled. Morrison's eyes tracked her hand, perhaps expecting her to produce some form of compliance document or resignation letter. Instead, she withdrew a small digital recording device, its red LED indicator clearly visible in the harsh office lighting. "Actually, Admiral, I think you're the one who's misunderstood the situation," she said, placing the device on his desk where both of them could see it clearly. "This conversation has been recorded from the moment I walked into your office." The color drained from Morrison's face as the implications of her words sank in. His carefully orchestrated intimidation session, including his demand that she remove her uniform, had been captured in its entirety. The evidence of his abuse of power, his attempts at blackmail, and his crude harassment were now preserved in digital format. "That's illegal recording without consent," Morrison stammered, reaching for the device. "You're in violation of federal wiretapping laws." Sarah smoothly intercepted his hand, her reflexes honed by years of combat training allowing her to move faster than the older officer could react. Her grip on his wrist was firm but not painful, just enough pressure to make her point clear. "Actually, Admiral, according to Navy Regulation 1752.3, any officer has the right to record interactions with superior officers when they have reasonable suspicion of misconduct or criminal activity," she said, releasing his wrist and taking a step back. "Given that I've been investigating your involvement in arms trafficking for the past month, I'd say my suspicions were more than reasonable." Morrison's shock was giving way to fury as he realized the extent to which he had been outmaneuvered. The trap he thought he had set for Sarah had instead become his own snare, and his demands for her uniform had provided her with exactly the evidence she needed to destroy his career. "You have no proof of any wrongdoing," Morrison said, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority despite the sweat that was beginning to bead on his forehead. "Whatever fantasy you've constructed about arms trafficking is nothing more than the paranoid delusions of an officer who's clearly suffered some kind of mental breakdown." Sarah reached into her other pocket and withdrew a thick manila envelope, its contents bulging with documents and photographs. As she opened it and began spreading its contents across Morrison's desk, his expression shifted from anger to genuine fear. "These are copies of bank records showing transfers of $3.7 million from Meridian Defense Solutions to your offshore account in the Cayman Islands," she said, pointing to a series of financial documents. "The dates correspond exactly with the unauthorized weapons shipments that went missing from our armory over the past 6 months." Morrison's eyes scanned the documents, his face growing paler with each piece of evidence she revealed. The financial trail was comprehensive and damning, showing not only the flow of money into his accounts but also the complex network of shell companies he had used to launder the proceeds. "Here are the shipping manifests from the cargo containers that were supposed to contain medical supplies for our humanitarian mission in Southeast Asia," Sarah continued, laying out a series of official-looking documents. Instead, they contained military-grade weapons that were delivered to insurgent groups in exchange for the payments documented in these bank records. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously organized. Sarah had spent weeks building an airtight case against Morrison, following the money trail through multiple countries and connecting the dots between his personal financial gains and the missing weapons shipments. Every transaction, every forged document, every clandestine meeting was documented with photographs, recorded conversations, and financial records. And this, Sarah said, producing a series of photographs that showed Morrison meeting with known arms dealers in various international locations, is surveillance footage from your meetings with Viktor Kozlov and his associates. Kozlov is currently wanted by Interpol for weapons trafficking and has been linked to terrorist organizations across 3 continents. Morrison stared at the photographs in stunned silence, recognizing locations from his supposed vacation trips to Europe and Asia. The images clearly showed him shaking hands with Kozlov, exchanging briefcases, and engaging in what were obviously business negotiations in luxury hotel lobbies and private restaurants. How did you? Morrison started to ask, then stopped himself, realizing that any admission of recognition would only further implicate him in the crimes Sarah had documented. How did I obtain surveillance footage from multiple international locations? Sarah asked, anticipating his question. That's where you made your second mistake, Admiral. You assumed that I was working alone. The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. His network of informants and co-conspirators, which he had thought was comprehensive enough to monitor any threat to his operation, had failed to detect a counterintelligence operation that was apparently much larger and more sophisticated than his own. For the past 8 months, I've been working with a joint task force comprising Naval Intelligence, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and Interpol, Sarah explained, her voice taking on a tone of quiet satisfaction. Your arms trafficking operation has been under surveillance since long before you even knew I existed. Morrison sank into his chair as the full scope of the investigation became clear. He had been so focused on his immediate threats and maintaining control over his subordinates that he had completely missed the larger net that was closing around him. His arrogance and sense of invulnerability had blinded him to the possibility that he might be the target of a professional law enforcement operation. The weapons you've been selling have been used in terrorist attacks that killed 43 civilians in Thailand last month, Sarah continued, her voice hardening as she described the human cost of Morrison's greed. Among the victims were 2 American aid workers and a family of refugees who were seeking medical treatment at the clinic that was bombed. The weight of his crimes was beginning to crush Morrison's composure. He had always rationalized his activities as victimless financial crimes, convincing himself that the weapons would have found their way to the black market regardless of his involvement. The reality that his actions had directly contributed to the deaths of innocent people, including Americans, was a burden his conscience was not prepared to bear. What do you want? Morrison asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The man who had commanded respect through fear and intimidation was now reduced to pleading with a subordinate officer who held his future in her hands. What I want, Admiral, is justice, Sarah replied, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. In approximately 30 minutes, agents from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service will arrive to place you under arrest. The charges will include conspiracy to commit arms trafficking, violation of the Arms Export Control Act, money laundering, and accessory to terrorism. Morrison's hands trembled as he processed the reality of his situation. His career, his reputation, his freedom, and his family's future were all about to be destroyed by the consequences of his criminal activities. The empire of corruption he had built over decades was collapsing around him in a matter of minutes. The evidence against you is overwhelming and irrefutable, Sarah continued, beginning to collect the documents and photographs from his desk. Your offshore accounts have been frozen, your co-conspirators have been arrested, and your network has been completely dismantled. There's no escape from this, Admiral. No amount of influence or intimidation can save you now. As if summoned by her words, the sound of heavy footsteps could be heard in the corridor outside Morrison's office. Sarah glanced at her watch and nodded with satisfaction. The timing was perfect, just as she had coordinated with the NCIS team that had been standing by for her signal. One more thing, Admiral, Sarah said, turning back to face Morrison as the footsteps approached his door. Your demand that I remove my uniform was the final piece of evidence we needed to add sexual harassment and abuse of power to your list of charges. That recording, combined with testimony from the 12 other female officers you've harassed over the past 5 years, ensures that you'll face the maximum possible sentence. The knock on Morrison's door was firm and authoritative. Sarah moved to open it, revealing 3 NCIS agents in dark suits, their badges clearly visible and their expressions professional but determined. Admiral James Morrison, the lead agent, announced, stepping into the office with his credentials extended, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit arms trafficking, violation of federal weapons export laws, and multiple counts of abuse of power. You have the right to remain silent." As the agents moved to place Morrison in handcuffs, Sarah gathered her evidence and prepared to leave the office that had been the center of the Admiral's corrupt empire. The man who had tried to destroy her career just minutes earlier was now facing life in prison for his crimes. "You destroyed the lives of dozens of officers to protect your criminal enterprise," Sarah said, pausing at the doorway to deliver her final words to Morrison. "You thought that fear and intimidation would always be enough to keep people silent. But you were wrong, Admiral. Justice has a way of finding those who think they're above the law." Morrison looked up at her from his position in handcuffs, his face a mixture of defeat and rage. The empire he had built through corruption and intimidation was ending not with violence or dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet satisfaction of justice finally being served. As Sarah walked away from Morrison's office, she could hear him being read his rights and informed of the charges against him. The investigation that had consumed months of her life was finally reaching its conclusion, and the feeling of vindication was tempered by the knowledge of how much damage Morrison's crimes had caused. The corridor was filled with sailors and officers who had gathered to witness the arrest of their commanding officer. Some looked shocked, others relieved, and a few appeared genuinely surprised that someone as powerful as Morrison could be brought down by the law he had spent so long circumventing. Sarah made her way to the communications center, where she needed to file her final report and coordinate with the international law enforcement agencies that had made Morrison's arrest possible. The investigation was far from over, as there were still co-conspirators to be arrested and victims to be contacted, but the most dangerous part of her mission had been completed successfully. The Admiral who had commanded through fear and corruption was finally facing the consequences of his actions, and Lieutenant Commander Smirked had proven that no one, regardless of rank or influence, was above the law. 3 hours after Admiral Morrison's arrest, the USS Valiant had transformed from a disciplined military vessel into a crime scene bustling with federal investigators, forensic accountants, and digital evidence specialists. Sarah Chen found herself at the center of the largest military corruption investigation in recent naval history, coordinating between multiple agencies while ensuring that the ship's essential operations continued without interruption. The NCIS team had established a temporary command center in the ship's conference room, where boxes of evidence were being cataloged and processed under the supervision of Special Agent Rebecca Martinez. Sarah had worked with Martinez before during a previous investigation, and their professional relationship had evolved into mutual respect based on their shared commitment to uncovering the truth regardless of the political consequences. "Commander Chen, the scope of Morrison's operation is even larger than we initially suspected," Martinez said, looking up from a laptop screen filled with financial transaction data. "The preliminary analysis of his banking records shows connections to arms dealers in 17 countries, with total transactions exceeding $12 million over the past 3 years." Sarah reviewed the data flowing across multiple computer screens, each one revealing another layer of Morrison's criminal enterprise. The financial forensics team had worked through the night to trace the money flow through the complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that Morrison had used to hide his profits. The weapons shipments weren't random or opportunistic, Sarah observed, studying a timeline that showed the correlation between Morrison's transactions and international conflicts. He was targeting specific regions where demand for military hardware was highest, essentially profiting from global instability and human suffering. The evidence revealed a sophisticated operation that went far beyond the simple theft and resale of military equipment. Morrison had been using his position to gather intelligence about upcoming military operations, then selling that information to arms dealers who could position themselves to supply weapons to all sides of various conflicts. Commander Lisa Rodriguez from Internal Affairs had arrived on the scene to coordinate with the various investigating agencies and ensure that proper protocols were followed throughout the evidence collection process. Rodriguez had been Sarah's primary contact during the early stages of the investigation, providing guidance and resources while maintaining the secrecy necessary for a successful operation. "Sarah, we've identified at least 15 other officers who were either directly involved in Morrison's operation or who were intimidated into silence," Rodriguez said, joining the conversation around the evidence analysis station. "Some of them have been providing information for months, but they were too frightened of Morrison's retaliation to come forward officially." The human cost of Morrison's reign of terror was becoming increasingly clear as more officers came forward with their stories. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh had been transferred to an undesirable posting after questioning discrepancies in supply manifests. Commander David Thompson had been denied promotion 3 times after refusing to sign off on suspicious cargo transfers. Ensign Maria Santos had been subjected to months of sexual harassment after accidentally discovering evidence of weapons theft. Morrison's intimidation tactics were systematic and calculated, Sarah said, reviewing testimony statements that painted a picture of an officer who ruled through fear and manipulation. He identified potential threats early and either recruited them into his operation or destroyed their careers before they could expose him. Special Agent Martinez pulled up a communication intercept on her laptop screen, showing encrypted messages between Morrison and his network of co-conspirators. The messages revealed not only the scope of his arms trafficking operation but also his efforts to identify and neutralize internal threats to his criminal enterprise. "This message thread shows Morrison discussing you specifically, Commander Chen," Martinez said, highlighting a series of encrypted communications dated 3 weeks earlier. "He knew about your investigation almost from the beginning and was planning to frame you for security violations if you got too close to the truth." Sarah read through the intercepted messages, feeling a chill as she realized how close Morrison had come to destroying her career and, possibly, her life. His plan had been to plant evidence of unauthorized intelligence sharing in her personal files, then use that fabricated evidence to justify her arrest and court-martial. Morrison had files prepared on dozens of officers, Rodriguez added, opening another laptop that displayed personnel records with detailed psychological profiles. He was using professional assessment data to identify vulnerabilities he could exploit, whether for recruitment, intimidation, or elimination as threats to his operation. The sophistication of Morrison's psychological manipulation became clear as the investigators reviewed his methods for controlling subordinates. He had used performance evaluations, promotion recommendations, and duty assignments as weapons to reward loyalty and punish dissent, creating an atmosphere where questioning his authority was tantamount to career suicide. Dr. Emily Patterson, a forensic psychologist brought in to analyze Morrison's behavioral patterns, had been studying the evidence for several hours when she made a disturbing discovery about the Admiral's escalation tactics. "Commander Chen, I need to show you something that changes our understanding of Morrison's psychological profile," Dr. Patterson said, pulling up a series of incident reports that had been buried in the ship's administrative files. Morrison's harassment of female officers wasn't just about power and control. He was using sexual intimidation as a screening process to identify officers who might be vulnerable to blackmail or coercion. The pattern was chilling in its methodical approach. Morrison would target female officers who were ambitious and capable, then subject them to increasingly inappropriate behavior while monitoring their responses. Those who reported his conduct were transferred or demoted. Those who remained silent were either recruited into his operation or subjected to escalating harassment until they requested transfers to other commands. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Ng documented 14 separate incidents of sexual harassment over a 6-month period, Dr. Patterson continued, displaying copies of official complaints that had been submitted but apparently ignored by Morrison's chain of command. When her complaints were dismissed, she requested an immediate transfer and was subsequently blacklisted from promotion consideration. Sarah felt a surge of anger as she realized the extent to which Morrison had weaponized the military's hierarchical structure to prey upon the officers under his command. His abuse of power went far beyond financial corruption, extending into systematic psychological and sexual harassment that had destroyed careers and traumatized countless individuals. The investigation took another significant turn when the digital forensics team announced that they had successfully cracked the encryption on Morrison's personal communication devices. The recovered messages revealed the existence of a larger network of corrupt officers operating throughout the Pacific Fleet, with Morrison serving as a regional coordinator for an international arms trafficking syndicate. "We're not just looking at one rogue admiral," Agent Martinez announced to the assembled investigators. Morrison was part of a criminal organization that has infiltrated multiple levels of military command structure across several allied nations. The scope of the investigation was expanding rapidly as new evidence revealed connections between Morrison's operation and similar corruption scandals in the Australian Navy, British Royal Navy, and Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. The weapons trafficking network had been using naval resources and intelligence from multiple countries to coordinate arms sales to conflict zones around the world. Sarah found herself assigned to coordinate with international law enforcement agencies as the investigation took on global dimensions. Her linguistic skills and intelligence background made her the ideal liaison for working with investigators from allied nations who were pursuing parallel cases against their own corrupt officials. "Commander Chen, we've received confirmation from Interpol that Viktor Kozlov has been arrested in Bangkok," Rodriguez reported, displaying a photograph of the arms dealer who had been Morrison's primary contact for international weapons sales. "His arrest has provided us with additional evidence linking Morrison's operation to terrorist attacks in Southeast Asia." The evidence continued to mount as investigators worked around the clock to unravel the full extent of Morrison's criminal enterprise. Financial records showed that weapons sold through his network had been used in attacks that killed over 200 civilians in 6 different countries, making him potentially liable for charges related to terrorism and crimes against humanity. As the investigation progressed, Sarah began to understand the true magnitude of what they had uncovered. Morrison's operation wasn't just about personal enrichment or abuse of power, it was part of a systematic corruption of military institutions that threatened national security and international stability. The weapons Morrison sold to insurgent groups in Thailand were later used in attacks against refugee camps housing displaced families, Sarah reported during a briefing with senior Navy officials. The profits from those sales were used to fund additional weapons purchases, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of violence and profit. The human cost of Morrison's crimes was staggering, but equally disturbing was the revelation of how many people had known about his activities but remained silent out of fear or self-interest. The investigation was exposing not just individual corruption but systemic failures in military oversight and accountability. Commander Rodriguez had been working with prosecutors to determine the appropriate charges against Morrison and his co-conspirators when she made a discovery that added another layer of complexity to the case. "Sarah, we found evidence that Morrison was being blackmailed by foreign intelligence services," Rodriguez said, showing encrypted communications that appeared to be from Chinese military intelligence. "His arms trafficking operation was being used to gather intelligence about American military capabilities and strategic planning. The national security implications were staggering. Morrison hadn't just been selling weapons for personal profit, he had been compromising military secrets and operational security in exchange for protection from foreign intelligence agencies. His corruption had created vulnerabilities that could have compromised military operations and endangered the lives of service members." As the third day of the investigation concluded, Sarah stood on the ship's deck looking out at the horizon, contemplating the magnitude of what they had uncovered. The investigation that had begun with suspicious financial transactions had revealed a web of corruption, espionage, and human rights violations that extended across multiple continents and involved dozens of individuals in positions of trust and authority. The arrest of Admiral Morrison was just the beginning of what would become the largest military corruption prosecution in modern history. The evidence they had gathered would lead to investigations in multiple countries, the exposure of international arms trafficking networks, and fundamental reforms in military oversight and accountability. For Sarah, the personal satisfaction of bringing Morrison to justice was tempered by the knowledge of how many people had suffered because of his crimes. The victims of the terrorist attacks, the officers whose careers had been destroyed, the service members who had been betrayed by someone they trusted to lead them with honor and integrity. The investigation was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for justice to be served and for systematic reforms that would prevent similar corruption from taking root in the future. Admiral Morrison's empire of fear and intimidation had been dismantled, but the work of healing the damage he had caused was just beginning. 6 months after Admiral Morrison's arrest aboard the USS Valiant, Sarah Chen sat in the witness stand of the military court at Naval Station Norfolk, facing a panel of judges and a courtroom filled with journalists, fellow officers, and family members of Morrison's victims. The court-martial proceedings had drawn international attention as the full scope of the corruption scandal continued to unfold across multiple countries and military organizations. Morrison sat at the defendant's table flanked by his legal team, looking dramatically different from the imposing figure who had tried to intimidate Sarah in his office. The months in military detention had aged him considerably, and the weight of his crimes seemed to have physically diminished the man who once commanded through fear and authority. His expensive uniform had been replaced with standard military detention clothing, and his once confident demeanor had given way to the hunched posture of someone who knew his fate was sealed. "Commander Chen, please describe for the court the circumstances that led to your decision to record your final conversation with Admiral Morrison," Prosecutor Colonel James Mitchell asked, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for this testimony, working with prosecutors to ensure that her account was both comprehensive and legally precise. The recording device she had carried into Morrison's office had captured not only his criminal admissions but also his attempt to sexually harass and intimidate her into silence. Based on my investigation into the Admiral's financial activities and the pattern of intimidation I had observed him use against other officers, I believe that any private meeting with him would likely involve attempts at coercion or blackmail, Sarah testified, her voice steady and professional. I wanted to ensure that there was an accurate record of our conversation for legal proceedings. The prosecution played portions of the recording for the court, and Morrison's voice filled the courtroom as he demanded that Sarah remove her uniform and threatened to destroy her career if she didn't comply with his demands. The impact on the courtroom was immediate and profound, with several observers shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they heard the crude abuse of power that Morrison had employed as his primary management tool. "The defendant's demand that you remove your uniform was recorded at what point in your conversation?" Colonel Mitchell asked, directing the court's attention to the timeline of events. "Approximately 17 minutes into our meeting, after he had already threatened me with court-martial and prison time if I didn't cease my investigation into his arms trafficking operation," Sarah replied. "His demand came immediately after I refused to turn over my evidence and sign a false statement admitting to misconduct." Morrison's defense attorney, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Foster, had attempted various strategies throughout the trial to minimize her client's culpability, but the evidence against him was overwhelming and incontrovertible. The financial records, surveillance footage, recorded conversations, and testimony from dozens of witnesses had created an airtight case that left little room for reasonable doubt. "Commander Chen, isn't it true that you were conducting an unauthorized investigation that exceeded your security clearance and violated several Navy regulations?" Foster asked during cross-examination, attempting to shift focus to Sarah's methods rather than Morrison's crimes. "My investigation was conducted within the scope of my duties as an intelligence officer and was authorized by the Joint Task Force that had been monitoring Admiral Morrison's activities for 8 months prior to my involvement," Sarah responded calmly. "All of my actions were reviewed and approved by appropriate authorities within naval intelligence and the FBI." The trial had revealed the extensive nature of the multi-agency investigation that had been building a case against Morrison and his network of co-conspirators. Sarah's role had been crucial, but she had never been operating alone or without proper authorization from the relevant oversight bodies. As the trial progressed through its third week, witness after witness took the stand to describe Morrison's systematic abuse of power and the devastating impact his crimes had on both military operations and civilian populations. The testimony painted a picture of an officer who had completely betrayed his oath of service in pursuit of personal enrichment and power. Captain Michael Torres, who had served under Morrison 3 years earlier, described how the Admiral had forced him to falsify cargo manifests and threatened his family when he expressed reluctance to participate in the weapons trafficking scheme. "Admiral Morrison told me that refusing his orders would result in my wife losing her job as a military contractor and my son being denied admission to the Naval Academy," Torres testified, his voice breaking with emotion. "He said he had connections throughout the military-industrial complex and could destroy our lives if I didn't cooperate." Lieutenant Commander Angela Foster testified about Morrison's sexual harassment campaign against female officers, describing incidents of unwanted physical contact, inappropriate comments about their appearance, and threats of retaliation against those who reported his behavior. "He created an atmosphere where reporting sexual harassment was tantamount to ending your career," Foster testified. "Officers learned to either tolerate his behavior or request transfers to other commands," which he would often block through his network of contacts in personnel management. The international implications of Morrison's crimes became clear through testimony from foreign intelligence officials who described how his arms trafficking operation had destabilized entire regions and contributed to ongoing conflicts in Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. Inspector General Patricia Williams from Interpol testified about the connection between weapons sold through Morrison's network and terrorist attacks that had killed over 300 civilians in various countries. The weapons Admiral Morrison sold to insurgent groups were specifically chosen for their effectiveness in urban warfare and their ability to cause maximum casualties among civilian populations, Williams testified. His operation wasn't just about illegal arms sales, it was about deliberately fueling conflicts that would create demand for additional weapons purchases. The psychological evaluation of Morrison, conducted by Dr. Emily Patterson, revealed a disturbing pattern of antisocial behavior and narcissistic personality traits that had enabled him to rationalize his crimes and abuse others without apparent remorse. Admiral Morrison displays classic characteristics of someone who views other people as objects to be manipulated rather than individuals deserving of respect and dignity, Dr. Patterson testified. His ability to compartmentalize his criminal behavior while maintaining a public facade of military professionalism suggests a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit institutional hierarchies for personal gain. As the prosecution prepared to rest its case, they called their final witness, Maria Santos, whose daughter had been killed in the terrorist attack in Thailand that had been carried out using weapons sold through Morrison's network. Santos spoke through a translator as she described the impact of losing her 8-year-old daughter in an attack on a refugee medical clinic. The courtroom was silent as she explained how her family had fled their home country seeking safety and medical treatment for her daughter's chronic illness, only to become victims of violence funded by Morrison's criminal enterprise. "My daughter died because someone decided that making money was more important than protecting innocent people," Santos said, her words translated for the court while she looked directly at Morrison. "She will never grow up, never go to school, never have children of her own because this man chose to sell weapons to people who kill children." Morrison's reaction to Santos's testimony was the first sign of genuine emotion he had shown throughout the trial. He appeared to shrink in his chair as the full human cost of his crimes was laid bare before the court and the watching world. The defense's case was brief and largely focused on attempting to mitigate Morrison's sentence rather than disputing his guilt. Lieutenant Colonel Foster argued that her client had been caught up in a system of corruption that was larger than any individual and that his cooperation with the investigation should be considered when determining his punishment. However, the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating in its comprehensive documentation of Morrison's role as a leader and organizer of the criminal enterprise rather than simply a participant caught up in someone else's scheme. Admiral Morrison was not a victim of circumstance, Colonel Mitchell argued in his closing statement. He was the architect of a sophisticated criminal operation that betrayed every principle of military service while causing immeasurable harm to innocent people around the world. His rank and position of trust make his crimes even more reprehensible, not less deserving of punishment. The court deliberated for 2 days before returning with their verdict. Morrison was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit arms trafficking, violation of the Arms Export Control Act, money laundering, sexual harassment, abuse of power, accessory to terrorism, and espionage-related charges stemming from his cooperation with foreign intelligence services. Judge Colonel Sarah Martinez read the sentence with the same precision and authority that characterized all military legal proceedings. Admiral James Morrison, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, forfeiture of all military benefits and decorations, and disgraceful dismissal from the United States Navy, she announced as Morrison stood to receive his fate. Your crimes represent the most serious breach of military ethics and betrayal of public trust this court has encountered. As Morrison was led away in shackles, Sarah felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the damage caused by his crimes could never be fully repaired. The families of his victims would carry their loss forever, and the officers whose careers he had destroyed would spend years rebuilding their lives and reputations. In the months following the trial, Sarah found herself at the center of efforts to reform military oversight and accountability systems to prevent similar corruption from taking root in the future. Her testimony before congressional committees and her work with international military organizations helped establish new protocols for monitoring arms shipments and investigating financial irregularities. The broader investigation spawned by Morrison's case led to the arrest and conviction of 47 other individuals across 6 countries, effectively dismantling an international arms trafficking network that had operated for over a decade. The reforms implemented in response to the scandal strengthened oversight mechanisms and created new protections for whistleblowers who reported misconduct by superior officers. Sarah was promoted to full commander and received commendations from multiple allied nations for her role in exposing the corruption network. However, she remained focused on the victims of Morrison's crimes and the ongoing work of preventing similar betrayals of military trust and civilian safety. The USS Valiant was reassigned to humanitarian missions in the Pacific, its crew working to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by their former commander's crimes. Under new leadership, the ship became a symbol of military professionalism and service to others rather than the platform for corruption and abuse it had become under Morrison's command. 5 years after Morrison's conviction, Sarah visited the memorial garden that had been established in Thailand to honor the victims of the terrorist attack that used weapons from his trafficking network. Among the names engraved on the memorial stone was that of Maria Santos's 8-year-old daughter, a reminder of the human cost of corruption and the importance of those who choose to stand up against it. Standing in the peaceful garden, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The decision to record her conversation with Morrison had seemed like a small act of self-protection at the time, but it had ultimately led to one of the largest military corruption prosecutions in history and reforms that would protect countless others from similar abuse. The garden was filled with flowers planted by community volunteers, their vibrant colors creating a living tribute to lives cut short by violence and greed. As Sarah placed her own flowers at the base of the memorial, she made a silent promise to continue working for justice and accountability in military service, ensuring that the sacrifice of Morrison's victims would lead to lasting change and protection for others. The Admiral who had tried to destroy her career through intimidation and abuse was now serving a life sentence in military prison, his empire of corruption dismantled and his legacy forever associated with betrayal and criminality. Sarah's courage in standing up to his demands had not only saved her own career but had also brought justice to hundreds of victims and created systemic changes that would protect future generations of military personnel and civilians alike.